one of my favorite hacks is to combine the modality of yoga and the modality of journaling. So one of the first things I like to share with people about this is that we're not talking about journaling as in like, dear diary, earlier today, such and such happened, right? That's not what we're talking about here. And especially if you're someone who has trouble meditating, trouble emptying your mind, doing this journaling can really, really help. And a lot of people in my community, when we've done journaling challenges or, journaling videos, combo yoga journaling that I put together, tell me that all of a sudden they're able to meditate because they sort of do this brain dump in the journal before sitting to meditate, and they find that very helpful.
Namaste. You're listening to the Sivana podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SivanaSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Szabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Sivana podcast. Now, for those that connect with me on social media, chances are you know that I'm leaving the Sivana podcast and have started my own podcast, The Anatomy of Living. Sivana podcast will continue under the guidance of our guest today, who I'm really excited to get to know more. Her name is Brett Larkin. She's a yoga teacher whose beginner morning yoga routine on YouTube has introduced thousands of students around the world to yoga with over 1 million views. She has a following of over 100,000 people on YouTube, and this year won YouTube's award for top emerging channels. She's also the founder of her own private online yoga community called Uplifted Yoga, which empowers students to personalize their practice and ignite their best life on and off the mat. And we're going to get to know Britt more today, as well as we dive into the topic of yoga hacking, which is one of her favorites. Yoga Hackers is also the name of her Facebook group, where she and thousands of students discuss how to integrate yogic principles into their daily life and how to combine yoga with other modalities such as journaling, positive thinking, and myofascial release to achieve personal and professional success. Excited for our chat today. Brett, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited for our chat. I'm a huge fan of all your work on the show, so super excited to be here today.
Thank you. And I'm excited to see where everything goes and evolves, getting ready for our chat and all that, looking at all your content on YouTube and your podcast and all the great stuff that you have. I'm happy knowing that the listeners will be in such great hands. And I'm happy today to dive in with you and get to know not only where you plan to go with the podcast a little bit more, but get to know you. You also have lots of wonderful insights into the practices of yoga. So let's find out more and get to know you.
Perfect. Sounds good. Where do you want to start?
Well, I'd love to know first how you got interested in yoga in the first place.
Oh, well, that's such a juicy question. I often say I can't really remember my life that well before yoga because it was a bit of a blur. I was your typical type A, very driven, very ambitious, had no idea that my thoughts weren't me. I lived in a constant state of anxiety, and that was basically my whole teen years and into my early 20s as well. I had so much fear about the future. I always thought that if something good happened, something equally bad would happen to even out the score. And I thought that way of thinking was just completely normal. So I luckily have loved movement my whole life, and I danced my whole childhood and always was really into dance and movement. And during my college years was taking a lot of Pilates in New York, where I went to university. It was through a friend of mine who said, you should really meditate. And I liked him a lot. So I said, oh, okay, I'll try. And so he and I started meditating together, but I didn't have any big breakthroughs there. It was very hard for me. Then he said, hey, you're really into dance and movement. You're a very physical, athletic person. Now we're meditating. How about you try yoga? And I just completely rolled my eyes. I was like, yoga, that's for hippies. I'm a dancer. I just absolutely not. But he kept pushing me to try it. And I think like a lot of people who are very, very driven and need their workout and are sort of at that place where I was, Bikram yoga was the most accessible way for me to get started. So I started going to Bikram yoga, and listeners, if you don't know Bikram yoga, it's a yoga in a heated room, so extremely intense. You do the same sequence every single time. You're looking at yourself in a mirror the whole time so you can track your improvement each week. And I got totally hooked. I just became a Bikram yoga junkie, as I think many people do when they first discover it.
Especially those type A personalities. They love the Bikram.
Exactly. And we can talk about this later, but this later inspired a lot of the yoga hacking I'm talking about, because a lot of times that first style of yoga that you're attracted to isn't necessarily the one that you need long term. And we can talk more about that later. Luckily, I kind of innately knew that. So I had a full year or something doing the Bikram, but I started to want to go deeper. And luckily, because I had a little bit of that meditation intro at the beginning, I knew that there was a lot more in the yoga world besides just sweating my guts out in a somewhat stinky room. So I began exploring every studio in New York. And this is a great yoga hack for people listening, is if you live in a city like I did in New York, or maybe you live in Boston or Chicago or wherever, most studios offer a 1-week free trial, or they offer a great intro special for students. And I really encourage everyone in my online community and that I meet in person to take advantage of these intro offers, because I really think yoga is like dating at the beginning. You want to date as many styles as you can to really figure out what's going to resonate and try to find that teacher that's going to resonate. So I think just also being kind of a poor student at the time, took up every studio in New York on these intro specials. And wow, was my mind blown when I found out just how much breadth there was to yoga. And of course, I very quickly fell in love with the practice and knew I wanted to go a lot deeper, and met my teacher, Alan Finger, who I eventually trained with at Ishta Yoga in New York, which is Integrated Science of Hatha, Tantra, and Ayurveda. He's also the founder of Yoga Works before he broke off from Yoga Works and started his own studio. So that's how it happened.
Before you actually started teaching, you worked in the video game industry, is that correct?
Yes, and you mentioned to me that you did as well, so this is very interesting.
You said, though, that you were working in some health and fitness type games. I wasn't as much. I worked for Activision. I was working on Mortal Kombat, which I wouldn't consider that a fitness game, even though there were some sports, and working a little bit on Blitz. I worked on a mech game for Activision, so it wasn't the stuff that you did. But you said you did that old dance game. Is that the one where you actually like move on the things that has now evolved even more?
Exactly. Yeah, I worked for Ubisoft back when Wii Fit and Just Dance and all those fitness and movement games were sort of coming to the forefront. And I loved it so much because it was a great way to integrate my love of technology and movement. So, figuring out if your hand is up by your shoulder, how do we score that? And how do we create cool dance moves that the Kinect camera can also read? And it was so much fun. And now I get to combine technology and my love of movement through making videos and YouTube and all that. But that was such a special time. And I know Activision well. I'm sure you knew Ubisoft as well, too.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of the technology and all this sort of stuff and teaching, I love the story about why you started your YouTube channel and teaching that way instead of in front of people. I was wondering if you'd share that story with us.
Oh, sure. I'm impressed that you have heard this story. So, and this is such a great lesson where, everyone is so unique and really needs to just begin and meet themselves where they are. I don't think there's one path for any student or any teacher. And for me personally, teaching a group class with real people was so intimidating as a new teacher. Not to mention I had a full-time job, I was very busy, and I just couldn't gather the courage to get out there and talk to studios and take that step. But for whatever reason, filming a video felt way safer to me. I think maybe because I was really used to working with cameras and technology from my job. I actually stole the camera I used to film my first YouTube video from the office where I worked.
Are you still legally liable for admitting that on the air? Although you admit it on your channel too.
I do. I gave it back. Eventually, someone in my office asked where it was, and then I was like, oh, I'll sneak it back in the office. I think they'd be okay with it now. But for me, that was the first step. And this is what I always tell students, and I talk a lot about in my uplifted community as well. It's like, when it comes to fear, you just have to take the step you can take. You know, a lot of times I think people feel like they need to take this big leap or they need to make this huge life change. And it's like, no, just take the one step forward that you can. And for me at that time, making a little video seemed like a way that I could teach, express, practice my teaching. And coming from the dance world, I really loved sequencing a lot because it was like choreography. And when I used to audition for dance camp or, you know, various things, we always had to send videos of something we choreographed or something we danced. So a lot of me making the video was I had designed a sequence I really liked as a new teacher, and I wanted to remember the sequence. I have another friend who, you know, she's amazing at writing her sequence and drawing her sequence. I have no artistic skills. So I was like, video is the way to go. So I made a little video of the sequence, and that little video is actually still on YouTube, and it has, I don't even know how many 100,000 views. And if you had told me that then, because it really was almost just like a little personal pet project, I would not have believed you. So, but it was fear. It was completely fear that I decided to teach online first. And then, of course, I ended up, you know, teaching in person too, but that came later.
And you've also taught, you said that you have a studio that was like your ideal studio to teach at. You finally got to teach there. So obviously come a long way from those initial fears.
Yes.
So I'm curious as well, and you mentioned it a little bit there, in that yoga is about honoring the tradition and the past, and that's a really important side of the practice, is that we do what was already established before. But then there's also this idea that like yoga has always adapted itself to the particular time and culture of the people. So it's gonna change. It's gonna look different in one culture in one time period than it does in another. And that doesn't mean that it's not yoga. That in and of itself is the heart of yoga. Now, with your yoga hacks, I can already see of how much you're into developing things. How important is it to you that we adapt this wonderful practice that has existed in many forms for thousands of years, but how important is it that we adapt it to our lives here in the now?
It's such a great question. Probably one of the best questions I've been asked, because I think for me especially, it's a place where I still have insecurity. As you say, we're dealing with a practice that's been around for thousands and thousands of years. And for certain yogis, and I so respect them, the honoring those traditions comes first. But for me personally, it doesn't. And I always say in my yoga teacher training too, because people ask questions and I'm like, well, this is the traditional answer, but I'm an anarchist, so this is my answer. I really believe that everyone needs to personalize their practice highly. That's kind of what yoga hacking is all about. And that your practice needs to be completely adapted to fit you and the time period in which we're living, which, as you say, is very different from thousands of years ago. So personally, I believe that this practice is meant to be adapted, and it's meant to fit into our daily life, not just, and this is another area where I think some super traditional yogis might disagree with me. I think this quest of spiritual enlightenment, or, you know, reaching samadhi, as they talk about in the Yoga Sutras, is wonderful. However, I've always been interested more in yoga because it brings me personal and professional success, because I'm grounded, because I'm balanced. And that's something at first with my channel and my work, I was very frightened to speak out about. But now I feel like it's necessary to speak out about, that you can be pursuing yoga because you want wealth in your life. You want intense romance. You want all the things you want to come true. And yoga is your most powerful aid and tool in manifesting your desires. And there's nothing wrong with that. Does it also give us a connection to source and something greater than ourselves? Absolutely. But I don't think, just meditating alone on a rock to reach nirvana, unless you're a very special person in a special time, is what most of us are going after right now, right? Most of us want harmony in our families, abundance and fulfillment in our work. And that's the yoga that I'm really interested in, is the yoga that helps me achieve that. And that, I think, is different for every person. And that's something that I don't think also gets talked about enough, how much this practice needs to be personalized. And when we actually do look back at the tradition so many years years ago, it was always taught one teacher to a group of students, but very much one-on-one. Like the practice was very individualized. If you think of like Mysore Ashtanga, right? The teacher was going around to each student and letting them know when they were ready to advance in the sequence. The sort of group exercise model we have with yoga right now, I think sometimes does a disservice to realizing or helping that student-teacher relationship really click, and then treating each person as an individual who needs to learn at a different pace, needs to be prescribed different postures and even maybe different styles of yoga, as we talked a little bit about before.
When we see those two, to overgeneralize, but those two main threads between classical yoga and tantra, where one is that vertical path looking to get you up and out, so do the crazy practices, get past the body, it's all an illusion anyways, versus the tantric paths, which are more life affirming. You can be in the world while doing your practice. It's about learning how to integrate those experiences into the experience of living. And you mentioned a word back there, wealth, and I'm curious what your definition of wealth is. When you say like, well, I use yoga to get more wealth and prosperity and all that, how do you define wealth?
That's a great question. And I was talking to a guest in one of my trainings about this as well. I think for a lot of us, wealth has the connotation of money, right? Being able to afford to live in the way that we want to. But I think wealth for me has come more and more over the years to really be about community, being surrounded by like-minded people, being rich in common values with people who are supporting you and you're supporting them. And that's where I think a lot of people think a lot of what's going on with online yoga is a little bit shallow or silly. But when I look at some of my communities, it is so powerful, especially because so many people don't have a local studio that they can go to with like-minded people who can uplift them, right? And act as that support and that mirror. And I think wealth also comes to your partner and your family and your home relationship. And I definitely don't think the limitation just has to be money. However, I like to mention money because I think that's something that a lot of yogis shy away from as a topic, or think have shame around the fact that they want to live in abundance, or they want to not just be able to support themselves teaching yoga, but be able to afford nice things and nice vacations and maybe be the sole provider for their family. So I think that's something that just needs to get talked about more. So that's why I proactively also trying to mention it.
Well, and it's something that I think I feel strongly about too, in terms of poverty being a virtue in many yoga communities, where it's like it doesn't actually serve anyone. It's not to say that the life of an ascetic or a monk or a nun isn't a valuable path, and that renouncing money and material possessions, all that isn't a valid thing to do. But for people living in the world to think that, well, I'm not a good yogi, or I feel shameful about having money, or feel bad about it, is super unfortunate, because it's part of that vertical model that was meant for the monks and not meant for the householders. And you get people that are stuck in like, well, because I have a car, I'm not a good yogi. Because I can't go to India and go study in a cave and find a guru, then I'm not really doing yoga, and this sort of thing. It's unfortunate because there is so much for the practice for everyone at different places in their lives, at different times in their lives. People can get a little militant in terms of like what yoga is supposed to be, and it's supposed to be this or that. And that to me is unfortunate. I think there's a way to honor the past, honor traditions, but also skillfully adapt the practice in ways that are much more meaningful for us today. I think that's a big part of myth as well. I mean, we've told lots of stories on the Sivana podcast, and learning the importance of myth not as something way out there, but as something that we can understand in our lives, which means maybe we don't understand that myth the same way that another culture does, or maybe we have to make our own myths to understand it. But there's no sense in my mind of taking old traditions for people in a completely different place, a completely different time, a different set of values, and then trying to plug it directly into our values, our culture, our time. There's a natural commingling there that I think is important, which is why I love the fact that you feel so strongly about being able to work with the practice, adapting it, and recognizing I don't need to give up my life in the world to be a great yogi. I can have a job, I can appreciate abundance and go on vacations with my family and not feel like, oh, I'm struggling just to pay my bills, and still be a good yogi. So I'm curious, this is a little more personal perhaps, but you said you started with Bikram. I'm curious to get your opinion of the whole scandal that went down with Bikram and all of that, and how you feel about Bikram now, whether it's the practice or the person. Do you still practice Bikram yoga at all? What are your feelings on that?
Great question. Well, in terms of the scandal and all the things that happened, I honestly don't even know the details because I tend to just blur out most news type stories. I have to say, I think he's a savvy business person, obviously. So there's part of me that goes, hats off to being very business oriented and very business minded. And I think a lot of yogis. So when you were talking about what you were before, I just kept thinking, how much people love to judge, right? Whether it's judging a yoga teacher for making money or not making money, or for, adhering to tradition or not. And anytime judgment, I try to catch judging thoughts like as quickly as I can and just disperse them. So, I definitely think he's a clever businessman for that. In terms of the actual Bikram style, this is something I could talk about forever. So please curb me. But I do think Bikram has huge value, especially as like sort of the gateway drug to yoga. It's this funny way to think of it. But if there hadn't been Bikram, I just wasn't in a place where I could go to a traditional hatha and vinyasa class and om out with everyone, or even, not work up a sweat. It wouldn't have worked. So I'm so grateful to Bikram because I think it meets a certain segment of people really where they are, and it gives them that hard workout and gives them the mirror and gives them the heat. And things that I think work so well in Bikram are that because it is so hot, it really teaches you how to breathe effectively, right? Because if you're just in your standard hatha class, that's, maybe challenging, maybe not, depending on what level you are, and it's just a typical temperature. You don't have to breathe in the yogic way that the teacher is instructing. But in Bikram, if you don't breathe, you're going to pass out. So I'm always really grateful for sort of those Bikram roots because I felt like it really trained me to breathe, and I took that with me out of the Bikram context. I also think Bikram's use of the mirror is incredibly unique. It's interesting how so many yoga studios don't have mirrors, and most of the studios I teach at today don't have mirrors, and I don't use the mirror as a tool. However, when teaching people online or teaching my members community, I super encourage people to take photos of themselves, look in the mirror, because if they don't have a teacher with them day to day, we can learn so much by looking at our own alignment in the mirror. And it's sort of shocking to me that people don't do that. It's like the cheapest yoga private you've ever had if you just look in the mirror and see like what your plank pose looks like. So those are the things I really love about Bikram. The concerns I have are that Bikram is the same series of postures every single class. And after yoga, my next big love became myofascial release and working with interconnective tissue. I even became a myofascial release therapist. And I know you interviewed Tom Myers on the show, who's also a friend of mine, and he's in my teacher training. Absolutely love him. And if you're listening and you don't know what the fascia is, it's your interconnective tissue. But all the research about fascia shows that fascia loves chaos, spontaneity, variety of movement, and not just from a fascial perspective. The more research that comes out about exercise shows that variety in our movements and our workouts is essential, which is another reason I think hacking yoga with other disciplines is super effective. So if you think of it through that lens, doing the same 28 postures every single class, if Bikram is the only thing you're doing. If you're doing Bikram once a week, fantastic. But if you're like I was, and that was your only workout at the time, only outlet, that concerns me because just everything I've studied about the interconnective tissue in the body and health just says we need more variety, we need more range of motion, and I worry about people getting repetitive stress injury as well. So those are kind of my pros and cons when it comes to Bikram, and I don't practice it now, but once in a blue moon I'll go, and it's always fun when I'm in there.
A couple of things that I'm hearing through that. One is the importance of not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, which is a pretty nasty expression perhaps. But in the sense of just the practice, I hear you talking about the practice of Bikram, which I think does have lots of value, and it's important to separate from the man. So without getting too much into all the sexual assault charges and all the sort of stuff that were levied at Bikram, what I'm curious is as a woman who is a yogini, and when a teacher like that comes out and you hear the things about how how he's treated women and what he's done. You said, well, you don't like to get into the judgment. And so I love to hear your perspective on that and how you use yoga to help you with that, because I will be completely straightforward and honest. When I hear things like that, I get upset. When I hear that there's injustice in the world, I make judgments on things. And I think there's a certain level of discernment there that is appropriate and necessary when living in the world. But I also think it can be consuming to get caught up in judgments about people and have that really affect things. So I love to hear your perspective on how you use the practice of yoga to help deal with that, whether we call it the inner critic that criticizes ourselves and others, or just self-judgment in general.
One of my favorite places to look for inspiration about this in particular is the Yoga Sutras, because Patanjali makes it really clear in the Yoga Sutras that our goal in yoga is to maintain equanimity of the mind. So it's actually not to be happy. We go over this in yoga teacher training, but it's like the goal of yoga actually isn't to be happy all the time. That's not realistic. And it's not to be sad or upset either. It's to be a master at being able to have equanimity in your mind. And I'm not going to be able to quote and remember the exact sutra off the top of my head, but one of my favorites, and I'm sure you know it too, is when he says, if you're surrounded, actually this is the principle of pratipashka bhavana, which is this cultivating the opposite, but he's like, if you're surrounded by negativity or negative thoughts, cultivate the opposite. If you can't, meaning, think positively instead. If you can't do that, he says in the next sutra, leave, right? Like, so if you can't, and maybe you're trying to quit smoking, and if you can't resist having a cigarette because you're at a party and everyone's smoking, leave the party, right? That's sort of what you have to do. So when it comes to a lot of these things, I think people could have definitely maybe accused me a little bit of burying my head in the sand, but I really am a believer in what Patanjali outlines there, where I always want to keep my mind like stable in that middle way. So if I'm reading something that's upsetting or, find myself getting triggered or riled up, I try to cultivate the opposite and think positive thoughts about the person, or I walk away and I just choose not to learn more about it. And people could definitely say that that's not the right approach, but overall, and especially the past few years in my life, that's the approach that I've taken. And I feel like it's not just Bikram, right? It was John Friend with Anusara. And I think this is where it becomes, instead of being about the practice, because I think Anusara is brilliant in so many ways, just like Bikram has so much value to offer, we get caught up in the person, right? And no person is perfect. Every person is flawed. And that's why I just like to stay focused on, well, what did they create? Sometimes a lot of people who create amazing things are kind of crazy people, right? But that's, part of their genius maybe was, it's like the same, two sides of the same coin. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And I'm also curious, you use journaling a lot as a means of processing thoughts and emotions. I was wondering if you could talk to us about that a little bit and how perhaps people listening can incorporate journaling a little bit more into their own, whether we call it actual yoga practice or it's just that practice of integration of their thoughts, their experiences and everything else. What are some ways that people can work with that, and how do you work with that personally?
Definitely. So one of my favorite hacks is to combine the modality of yoga and the modality of journaling. So one of the first things I like to share with people about this is that we're not talking about journaling as in like, dear diary, earlier today, such and such happened, right? That's not what we're talking about here. There's 3 types of journaling that I like to work with, and I'm happy to walk people through these 3 ways because I think you can use them at home. What I would suggest as what to do is to do some yoga or get your heart rate up. So if you're a runner, go for a run. If you like to do some sun salutes or a full yoga class, do that first. Maybe sit quietly for a little bit. And especially if you're someone who has trouble meditating, trouble emptying your mind, doing this journaling can really, really help. And a lot of people in my community, when we've done journaling challenges or, journaling videos, combo yoga journaling that I put together, tell me that all of a sudden they're able to meditate because they sort of do this brain dump in the journal before sitting to meditate, and they find that very helpful. So if you're someone who is struggling a little bit with meditation, I would offer this up. So the first way that you can journal, and also note that I always journal pretty much on my yoga mat. So I'm either in pigeon pose pose, or again, in my videos, I outline all these different poses which are sort of convenient to journal in. So I'm really fusing the physical asana practice and the writing process together. But the first way is what I call release journaling. And this is where you just write down questions or things that are on your mind. And this journaling session could just turn into a rant of you it's like word vomit onto the page. So anything you're thinking, any worry inside you, any fear, you just write it down. You don't think, you just write. And it sounds maybe overly simple, but it's actually immensely therapeutic because it's sort of like you're letting your subconscious, instead of constantly shoving it down, you're saying, hey, you get to run the show here. What do you want to release? What do you want to let out? That's why I call it release journaling. And sometimes it takes the form of a very vicious rant. And sometimes it's just blah. And then you're like, when you look back at what you wrote, you're like, oh, I didn't even know I was worried about that. Or, oh, the reason I feel a little off is actually because of this issue. Like you look back at the page and you see it's just such a great insight to what might be secretly driving or motivating you throughout your day. And it's also so affirming and yogic, I think, because it teaches us ultimately what yoga really taught me, which is that you are not your thoughts. Right? Once you see those thoughts on the page, it's sort of like you get this separation where you're like, these thoughts are not me, which I think is so great. Let me know if you want to chat about that one. Otherwise, I'll go into the next style of journaling.
As you like. Keep it going.
Okay, I'll keep rolling. So the second way people can try journaling at home, if just this release, like just writing stream of consciousness on the page doesn't work, is what I call free form journaling. And this is a little bit of a Jekyll and Hyde journaling tactic. So what you do is you sort of write your questions, again, your fears onto the page, but this time you actually invite your highest self to journal with you and to respond to the different things that you're writing about. So you might write, I have so much fear about XYZ. I'm terrified. I don't know what to do, blah, blah, blah. And then you pause. And again, it's very helpful if you do yoga or even meditate before doing this. But then you respond like as if you were reading someone else's, or imagine it was your own child's journal or a close friend's. How would you respond? And a lot of times, like this higher self, this intuitive wisdom just starts writing. And it's like, you don't have to be afraid. You're strong. Like all of a sudden this stuff just starts coming out of you. And that's where it kind of takes this like weird Jekyll and Hyde journaling approach. But I've done this and I've solved really intense problems for myself this way. And it's sort of like how we talk about your big self, the big Atman self, just is able to somehow through writing powerfully and intuitively be there for you and support you in the fears that you have or the concerns that you have. And if you can get into a journaling session like this, it's super exciting because it's basically free therapy from the person who knows what's really best for you, yourself. And it's just so empowering to see what that intuitive voice has to say to you on the page. And then the last type of journaling, which is I think is the easiest. So if you've been worried and listening, you're like, I don't think I can do either of the first two. This one's really simple and it's what I call intention journaling. So if you have no idea what to write, you're like, I can't even write stream of consciousness, what's in my head. And the stream of consciousness is very much inspired by The Artist's Way and Julia Cameron's work, but it could literally be like, I'm hungry, I want coffee, I don't want to write right now, but it starts getting deeper. But if you think you can't even do that, which I get, I'd really encourage you to do this third type, this intention journaling. And when you can't get yourself to write questions or stream of consciousness, what you write is you just write what you want. You just write what you want in the present tense as if it's already happening as a way to manifest what you want. So I might write, my July retreat in Italy has 25 people in it. We are walking cobblestone streets in the sunshine. I've attracted the exact 25 souls that need to be on this experience with me. I'm filled with so much abundance, joy, and happiness. That's like a desire that's in the present tense as if it's manifesting right now. And for someone else, it might be, I've received my promotion or I've met the love of my life. Just whatever it is you want, you just write what you want. And then if you run out of things to write, you just write them again. So you just write the exact same thing. It almost becomes like an affirmation intention. You just write it again and again and again. So in days when I don't have anything to journal, and I actually have free journaling pages that help people do this on my website at brettlarkin.com/journal, I believe it is. But I give you space to write whatever your intention is 4 times. Because if we talk about mind-body connection, I think actually writing out something in longhand over and over and over again really helps firm the pattern in your brain. And some people might be really comfortable with affirmations and sort of saying those kinds of things out loud, which is really powerful, and do that if you're comfortable with it. But for me, that always felt a little phony and scary, especially at the beginning. And writing it multiple times was such an easier way for me to tap into that intention. And it's powerful. I know it sounds simple, but it's powerful. Like when you're writing that intention 5 times on a piece of paper every single morning, over and over and over again, you're gonna betcha that it is at the forefront of the mind, and it's starts to align the rest of your activities that day to start manifesting that to actually happen.
You mentioned earlier about some of with students and being able to access yoga online nowadays. And I like the perspective as well of, as a teacher, being able to reach not only students that you couldn't in your community, but a large amount of students. I mean, you have literally hundreds of thousands of followers on YouTube. What is the most common thing in your interactions with your community there that you're seeing with people in terms of their struggles or their concerns or their worries? Like, what are people, at least in your community, what are they struggling with today?
A lot of people have injuries. A lot of people want to know how to modify. I mean, those are sort of the basics. A lot of people, I think, just want connection and feel alone, because I don't know if you went through this too, but I think a lot of times when people start getting into yoga, it ends up being not just this class they're going to once a week or some exercise they're exploring. It starts to yoga has this magic way of infiltrating our soul, basically. So suddenly you kind of want to eat differently, and maybe you kind of want to think differently, and you don't really want to hang out with the people that you used to hang out with. So I think a lot of people are craving answers to questions in terms of how to personalize their practice. Say that's number 1. And 2, they're craving connection, because I think it can be, while having, I don't know if we want to call it a spiritual awakening or just doing self-development work, however we want to call it, doing that work can be very exciting, but it can be extremely isolating, especially if members of your family or close-knit community aren't supportive or aren't going through the same thing. So I think with online, it's like we have this massive opportunity to help people personalize their practice or point them in the right direction. You know, it's like, oh, get yoga blocks. Oh, you can fold forward with your hand on 2 blocks. Or, oh, do the sciatica pain video if this is what you're experiencing. Like being able to help them tailor and personalize. And that's basically what I do in the paid community. And it's amazing, because now that I have people who've trained with me, and even people who haven't, we have tons of teachers in the group, everyone's just helping one another get pointed in the right direction. Because I think something that's so often overlooked is how active a participant we need to be in personalizing our own practice. I think it's a shame when someone's just like, oh, well, I'm a hardcore Ashtangi, that's all I do, the end, and that's it. Sure, maybe that works for a couple years, but we all go through, like, change is the only constant, right? So knowing that, and I think we all agree on that as yogis, how can we be pulling in more styles of yoga, more ways to just, again, personalize for our own injuries, for our own limitations, for how we want to improve, to really use yoga as a means to improve our lives. So yeah, I think modifications, questions about injuries, and then just trying to get connected to like-minded people is the biggest thing I see out there online.
If we can change a little bit of direction here. So you have your yoga hacks podcast now. You're taking over the Sivana podcast. What can people expect from you with the podcast? What can they not expect? What are your feelings on going forward from here with the Sivana podcast?
Well, you have done such an amazing job. So I definitely want to keep the podcast in the vein that you've set up, with a focus on education, with bringing in incredible guest speakers. And I've already recorded a couple episodes that I'm super excited to share. I think, and we were talking about this before we started recording, a lot of what I put on YouTube and even my own personal podcast is very much for people who are maybe new to yoga, right? Because most people on YouTube are new or they're curious. What I'm really excited about doing with Sivana and what you've done such a great job with is really going deeper, right? And figuring out how, just asking really intelligent, great questions to incredible guests and getting more knowledge that way, so that listening to the podcast feels like you just went to a really cool workshop or got a ton of actionable insight and value. So my hope with the podcast and my plan is to continue in that same vein and make sure that there's actionable takeaways for people in every episode and really bring on incredible guests. So some of the ones I've recorded so far is with a fellow teacher who I love, who actually also teaches on YouTube. We talk all about shadow yoga and the shadow self and go very much into a little bit Carl Jung and yoga. I've also talked to some people who completely nerd out on just yoga breathing with me. So those are the kind of things that you can expect. And honestly, you've done such an incredible job, and I'm so honored to hopefully carry on the torch and keep the quality and the guests and the content extremely high.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate that both for what you said there, but also I'm excited that to see you go forward and continue on with the podcast. Even the short amount of time that I have been able, when we were discussing this and getting ready for our chat today, of looking at all your content and stuff, I'm excited to see how you develop it, how you make it your own. And before then, what's the best way for people to connect with you when they want to find out more about you, your website, your YouTube channel? Tell us, for the people that are listening to this now, how they can connect to you and get all that good stuff even before the full shift starts to happen.
Wonderful. So my website is brettlarkin.com. So it's BRETTLARKIN. And right on that front page, you can get my ritual series, which is this series that combines yoga and journaling and meditation. So if you're interested in that, grab that. And YouTube, Brett Larkin Yoga. I'd love it if you subscribed. It's pretty easy to find. Just type my name into YouTube. And those journaling pages I mentioned are at brettlarkin.com/journal. The Yoga Hacks Facebook group is yogahackscommunity.com, yoga HACKS community. And it's completely free and just really fun. There's always a great thread and discussion topic happening on there. So definitely looking forward to connecting with everyone through some YouTube videos and then on the podcast as well.
And your dog is very excited about it in the background too.
He is. I don't know if we should re-record. He's, I think, very traumatized because my husband just left to go to work.
Dad, come back.
I know.
Well, it's been a pleasure getting to know you a little bit more. I look forward to listening to the podcast with you, taking the reins, and to see what you come up with, and to listen to all the great guests and insights that you bring. I'm sure that our audience today has learned something not only about you, but learned some helpful tips on integrating yoga into their lives. It's been a pleasure. And for all the listeners out there as well, thank you so much for this time that we've had together. I am confident that you're in great hands. If you do want to connect with me, you can head over to either connect with me on Facebook, my website, Anatomy of Living, or on my new podcast, the Anatomy of Living podcast. I'm excited to connect with you guys either way, and really excited to see where the Sivana podcast continues to go. Any last words, Brett?
No, I'm looking forward to having you back on the show after a little bit. So we'll hear from Ashton again. We're going to stay in close touch.
Indeed. Well, I'm happy to come back on the show anytime. And for all of our listeners out there, thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. We hope you have a very present moment. Namaste. Hey everybody, it's Ashton here with an announcement. We're starting a weekly contest giveaway over at Sivana Spirit. If you'd like to enter into the contest to win one of our weekly prizes, go to sivanaspirit.com/contest. If you enjoyed listening to the podcast today, we'd really appreciate it if you went over to iTunes, left us a review, leave us some comments, and share this podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy it. Also want to invite you to go check out Sivana East, which is the name of our blog and also the name of a Facebook group where I interact with guests and our audience. We'll post recent episodes up there, as well as interesting articles relating to our guests and or the topics on the shows. And again, thank you so much for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Sivana podcast. To find out more about Sivana, go to savanaspirit.com or follow Sivana on Facebook at facebook.com/Sivana Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at sivanaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Sivana podcast.